It's often said that inside each of us are many different people. But for those who suffer split personalities, this is true to the extreme. Their stories are as fascinating and frightening as they are unexplained. The onset of multiple personality typically occurs in childhood, but the condition is usually detected much later in life. Alternate personalities often emerge after a traumatic experience. On a cold January morning in 1988, Gary, a 41-year-old Wisconsin dairy farmer, sat up in bed and stared blankly at his wife of 20 years.
Gary woke up, looking around the room with that where am I look on his face. And I was in shock. This wasn't Gary. This was a different person.
Gary's voice was lighter, softer. His actions were feminine. His wife, Catherine, grew more and more frightened.
Instead of Gary getting dressed in Gary's clothes, this person was going through my clothes, putting on my clothes. I had to get that person. I had to get Gary out of that house. So we drove around all day, just drove around.
Gary told Catherine that he had no idea who she or their 6 children were. Instead, he announced that he was a woman named Mary.
I'm thinking Gary went crazy. Yep, yes, absolutely, Gary went crazy. This wasn't Gary. And this new person doesn't know the children. Doesn't even know anything about our life. Lost person. Lost.
The husband Catherine knew was a hard-working family man who loved her and their children. This wasn't the man she had married 20 years ago. When Catherine and Gary were young newlyweds, they knew exactly what they wanted out of life: a large family and a small dairy farm. Their early years with their children were everything they had wished for.
I always remembered us taking picnics and us going out in the front yard and playing football, because my dad was always into that sort of thing. We'd always play and rough around. But some of my best memories are just us all hanging out and pretty much just being a family.
Their idyllic life was shattered when their eldest child, a vivacious 8-year-old girl named Chrissy, was diagnosed with brain cancer. At the time, doctors told Gary and Catherine that Chrissy only had a few weeks to live. Chrissy proved the doctors wrong by surviving surgery and keeping a tenuous grasp on life. Gary and Catherine spent most of their time caring for their eldest child. Medical bills piled up, and their farm went bankrupt. In 1978, they were forced to rent a small house in Platteville, Wisconsin. One day, 4 years later, Chrissy developed pneumonia and had to be rushed to the hospital. All through the night, Gary kept vigil outside her door. Early the next morning, during a procedure to insert a heart monitor, Chrissy went into full cardiac arrest. Gary watched helplessly as resuscitation efforts failed, and Chrissy died.
As if somebody shoved a knife right into you and just kept on cutting. I mean, you can't even think of anything that horrible.
It is believed that at this exact moment, Gary's personality began to split. Both Gary and Catherine were left with a terrible void in their lives. Catherine took solace in her books, while Gary seemed to undergo an abrupt personality change. At age 36, Gary, who had never excelled at school because of his dyslexia, now grew obsessed with studying to become a doctor. These changes in both their parents left the children bewildered.
A lot of part of my childhood after Chrissy's death was Mom in her room and Dad gone, trying to find work or working or in school.
The family remained like this for 5 years, until Gary graduated from college and was then faced with another trauma. This one would drive him over the edge. Catherine was told by her doctor that she had a fatal case of ovarian cancer. It turned out the diagnosis was a mistake. Catherine was in no danger, but for Gary, the possibility that he might also lose his wife to cancer was too much for him to bear, and something in him snapped.
That is when Gary started to fall apart. I came home from the hospital ecstatic. Here, I've got a clean bill of health after thinking I was dying, after these doctors said you're dying, and I wasn't dying.
I had a breakdown of some type. I don't know what all happened.
It was the next morning that Catherine woke up to find a stranger sleeping next to her, someone who called herself Mary. Catherine, who had grown distrustful of all doctors, did not take her husband to a psychiatrist.
If I wouldn't have had the background with Chrissy, and if I wouldn't have just come off of being so sick myself, maybe I would have handled it different, but the fear of doctors was there. I should have rushed him to the hospital.
After a week of total confusion, Gary left the house, moved to Milwaukee, got an apartment and a job, and started living as a woman. Gary left home, insisting that he was a woman named Mary. He moved to Milwaukee, where he got a job operating heavy equipment. All of his new friends believed he was really a woman.
This is a big woman. Basically, that was it. She had her hair done, she had makeup on, her nails were done, and she was just very sweet and very demure and very ladylike and very feminine.
The small town he had left behind, however, was not ready to accept his mysterious transformation. Neighbors decided Gary had either become a transvestite or had gone insane. Catherine turned to her Catholic church for support, but found she was shut out.
The people in my prayer group at my church disowned me. Right in front of the tabernacle, one of them said to me, "We bind you from praying with us." And my thoughts are, oh dear God.
Catherine was forced into a world of secrecy.
How do you talk about this? How do children say to their neighbors and to their friends, my father is gone and now there's this person wearing a dress? I'm lying to everyone. Gary's down in Milwaukee. When people in Milwaukee would call, I'd say, Gary's somewhere else.
3 months after Gary left home, checks and cordial letters asking about the kids began arriving at the house. They were signed Mary.
A part of Mary at some point started to recognize that we were family. I was addressed as sister, my sister.
But Catherine still had no insight into what had happened to her husband. Gary, living as Mary, was just as confused and sought help from a psychotherapist.
She came into the clinic and initially presented with what looked like a gender identity disorder.
The man who called himself Mary told the therapist that he couldn't understand why he had male sex organs. Psychological evaluations showed that he had huge memory gaps and absolutely no recall of life before waking up that strange morning next to his wife, Catherine.
So at that point, what I did was ask her if she could please bring in a family member to talk with us also, because I really wasn't sure what was going on.
Mary decided not to go back to the therapist, but did stay in contact with Catherine. And Catherine, desperate to hold on to her relationship with her husband, became Mary's best friend. Within 2 years, Catherine convinced Mary to come live with her and the children. They purchased an old run-down farmhouse and some dairy cows. The children agreed to call their father Aunt Mary, but the arrangement was devastating.
I used to scream not to go to school. I mean, my principal said that my dad's a lunatic and that I'm never going to make anything out of myself. But those were times when I used to cry a lot because I just didn't want to go because people were just so crappy to me.
They lived like this for 3 difficult years. Deserted by relatives and close friends, Catherine was desperate for an answer. She convinced Mary to go back to psychotherapist Gretchen Fink. Catherine went along.
Then Catherine began to tell me about what was really going on, and I began to realize this probably was not a gender identity disorder situation, but was something else.
What the something else was became clear early one morning while Gary, still living as a woman named Mary, was doing chores around the farm and was knocked unconscious by a freak electrical accident.
She opened her eyes, and now I'm seeing another stranger again. This lost look, where am I? Look.
The 47-year-old man could barely speak or walk. Gary was no longer Mary. Now he behaved like an infant. Catherine called Gretchen Fink, who urged her to rush him to a hospital. Catherine was initially reluctant, but Fink agreed to meet them there.
I walked into the room, and this person that I've now known for 5 years looks at me as though they've never seen me before. It was at that point that I began to think about multiple personality disorder.
A person has to have at least 2 distinct alternate personalities to be diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. With the emergence of the baby personality, it was finally possible to say what had happened to Gary. This was a consolation for the family, but not a cure for Gary. They took care of him as they would a baby. He drank from a bottle and ate baby food. Then one morning, 8 weeks later, just as mysteriously as he had disappeared, Gary returned.
After 6.5 years of not seeing or talking to Gary, Gary woke up.
His last memory was of being in the hospital, watching his daughter Chrissy die.
I said that they killed Chrissy. She was in a hospital. Some interns came in there without authorization. They wanted to do a heart cath. This was in the middle of the night. And they shoved her into cardiac arrest. And that was it. And I went bonkers. When I saw my children for the first time, I didn't believe how big they were. I didn't even know them. I had to get to know them again.
2 months after his return, Gary and Catherine renewed their marriage vows. For Gary, realizing that he suffers from multiple personality disorder does not take away the guilt he feels about the time he has lost with his family.
I feel that I've let my kids down by not being here. I've let Catherine down by not being here, but I can't help it. My body just splits in 2 and 3 or whatever it is, and it's very difficult.
Multiple personality disorder is one of the most mysterious diseases of the mind. In Gary's case, why did he split into these different personalities? What caused his disorder? Psychiatrists explain that, strange as it may sound, some people develop a kind of alternate personality in response to severe trauma and stress. It is a process called dissociation.
People under stress talk about feeling as though they're falling apart. They feel as though they're beside themselves. And I think they're really describing what happens under severe stress is that people end up feeling very fragmented in some ways. They can't collect themselves and function as an integrated person.
There is much that is still unexplained about the disorder, but one thing is clear. All so-called multiples suffered some form of repetitive childhood trauma. In Gary's case, according to his wife, he was physically abused as a child. And like most multiples, his disorder revealed itself in adulthood, after a traumatic experience. The horror of watching his daughter die probably caused Gary to dissociate as an adult. Today, not only does Gary have no memory of his 6 years as Mary, he also does not remember college, a total memory loss of almost 11 years.
By taking on the other personality, then they don't remember the stress or the trauma, and they don't have to deal with it. So ultimately, it's kind of an ultimate defense system.
It's impossible to say why Gary chose to return when he did. His psychologist explains that for some unconscious reason, Gary finally felt safe and ready to re-emerge. For now, Gary's alternate selves still take over his body when he is under stress, something his family has said they are prepared to live with.
Mary's a part of him. Baby's a part of him. I love all three. I'd prefer my dad, but, and you just have to accept it. And I'm not going to say, well, I hope that all of a sudden something happens and he's no longer Mary or Baby, because it's unrealistic.
It's like hell on earth once in a while, because you just don't know what the next hour, minute is going to do. And it scares you to death once in a while.
Multiple personality disorder is difficult to diagnose because most multiples go undetected, spending years in the mental health system, struggling with depression, suicidal tendencies, and drug or alcohol abuse. It's a life of torment and despair.